When an avoidant and an empath both cut off contact at the same time, something happens that almost nobody talks about, and it's not what you'd expect. Most people assume the empath falls apart. Most people assume the avoidant simply moves on, clean, easy, unaffected. But that's not what's actually happening inside either of them. What unfolds is something far messier, far more painful, and honestly far more fascinating than any breakup story you've ever heard. Because when these two particular types of people cut off contact, they don't just lose a relationship, they lose the mirror they were using to make sense of themselves, and that changes everything. Stick with me, because over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens to both of them, day by day, week by week, and why so many of them end up making the same fatal mistake that drags them right back into the cycle. If you've ever lived through one of these relationships, or you're in one right now, this is going to feel uncomfortably accurate. Before we go any further, drop the word mirror in the comments right now. Just that one word. It shows me you're really here, that you're paying attention, and it helps this video reach the people who genuinely need it. And if this kind of deep emotional insight is what you've been craving, subscribe to Empathy, because this is exactly what we do here. So let's start right at the beginning. Let's start at the exact moment no contact begins. Not the moment someone decides to go no contact. Not the planning, not the journaling, not the conversations with friends weighing whether it's the right call. The actual moment. The moment the last message gets sent, the last door shuts, the last phone call ends. That specific second when the silence starts. For the empath, that moment feels like stepping off a cliff in slow motion. For the avoidant, that moment feels like finally being able to breathe again. And right there, inside those two completely opposite internal experiences, is the seed of everything that follows. Now, to really understand this, you need to understand what these two people have been doing to each other, often without even realizing it, for the entire length of the relationship. The empath is someone who feels everything intensely, not in some poetic, romanticized way, but in a very real, very draining, very consuming way. They pick up on emotional signals the way a radio picks up frequencies, other people's moods, other people's pain, other people's unspoken needs. They soak up all of it. And inside a relationship, this means they become incredibly tuned into their partner. They catch the micro expressions, they catch the tiny shift in tone. They sense something's wrong before their partner has even consciously noticed it themselves. With an avoidant partner, this becomes both their gift and their curse. The avoidant, meanwhile, is someone whose entire nervous system was trained, usually back in childhood, to link emotional closeness with danger, not necessarily dramatic, traumatic danger. Sometimes it was simply a parent who couldn't be emotionally present. Sometimes it was a home where expressing feelings led to shame, or rejection, or just nothing at all, no response, no acknowledgement, only silence. And so the child learned, feelings aren't safe, closeness isn't safe, independence is the only thing you can actually rely on. That child grows into an adult who genuinely craves connection, but is just as terrified of it. And when an empath and an avoidant come together, something electric and something devastating happen at the exact same time. The empath feels like they've finally found someone worth saving, someone with so much hidden depth, someone clearly carrying so much pain beneath the surface. And if they could just reach far enough, if they could just love hard enough, something beautiful would finally break open. Meanwhile, the avoidant feels, often for the first time in a long while, genuinely seen. The empath's attentiveness feels incredible to them. Someone actually understands them without needing them to explain, without needing them to be vulnerable, without needing them to do the terrifying work of opening up. The empath does that work for them, reads them, understands them, accepts them. And so they're pulled together like two planets whose gravitational fields were built for each other's undoing. The relationship settles into a pattern. The empath chases. The avoidant retreats. The empath chases harder. The avoidant retreats further. The empath reads that retreat as proof they haven't loved enough, haven't been enough, haven't done enough. So they give more, bend more, shrink more. And the avoidant, feeling the mounting pressure of all that closeness, pulls back even further. This cycle keeps spinning, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, until someone finally hits a wall. Sometimes it's the empath who burns out completely. Sometimes it's the avoidant who reaches their breaking point of overwhelm. Sometimes both happen almost simultaneously, and that's when no contact begins. And this is where things get genuinely fascinating, because no contact isn't simply an absence of communication. It's an entirely different kind of conversation, one that unfolds completely inside each person's own head. And these two internal conversations, happening at the same time on opposite ends of that silence, are almost impossible to reconcile. Let's follow the empath first. Day one of no contact for the empath isn't peace, it isn't relief, it isn't the triumphant sigh of someone who finally made the right call for themselves. Day one is a kind of free fall. The empath's entire system is built to scan for connection. Their nervous system has spent months, maybe years, tracking every mood shift in their avoidant partner, every text, every silence, every small gesture, every withdrawal. That constant tracking took up an enormous amount of their internal energy, and suddenly there's nothing left to track. The signal has vanished, and the tracking system doesn't just switch off, it spirals. They check their phone constantly, not because they're weak, but because their nervous system is doing exactly what this relationship trained it to do. It's searching for the signal that would tell them everything is okay. They replay old conversations, not to punish themselves on purpose, but because their mind is desperately hunting for the exact moment things went wrong, the precise sentence, the specific turning point, so they can understand it, fix it, keep it from happening again. They feel guilt, even if the relationship was painful, even if they were the one who chose to walk away. Because empaths tend to absorb responsibility for other people's pain, and the thought of their avoidant partner sitting alone in silence, maybe hurting, maybe needing them, feels almost physically unbearable. And underneath all of it, underneath the phone checking and the replaying and the guilt, sits something even deeper, something the empath often can't even put into words. By week 1, a profound question about identity surfaces. If I'm not taking care of this person, who am I? Because so many empaths, especially ones who grew up in homes where their emotional needs came second to everyone else's, have built their entire sense of self around being needed, around being the one who understands, around being the emotional anchor inside other people's storms. Without that storm, they don't know where to stand. This isn't weakness. This is a deeply human reaction to a deeply human wound. Now let's turn to the avoidant on day 1. Day 1 for the avoidant often feels like relief, and they'll feel guilty about that relief, which they'll then push down quickly, because sitting with guilt means sitting with a feeling, and sitting with feelings has never been comfortable for their system. But the relief is real, the pressure is gone, that constant undercurrent of someone needing more from them than they knew how to give. The guilt of never quite meeting the empath's emotional needs. The claustrophobia of being seen so clearly by someone who wanted so much access to their inner world. All of it lifts. And for the first few days, maybe even the first week or two, the avoidant genuinely feels okay. They stay busy. This part matters. The avoidant's go-to coping strategy is activity, distraction, forward motion. They'll throw themselves into work. They'll exercise more. They'll call up old friends. They'll launch a new project. They'll fill every hour of every day with something that doesn't require them to actually feel anything. And for a while, it works. But somewhere around the 2 to 3 week mark, something starts happening that the avoidant isn't prepared for. The silence begins to have a texture. It's not the comfortable quiet of someone who chose solitude on purpose. It's a silence that feels hollow in a way that's hard to explain. There are moments, usually small and unexpected, where something happens and the avoidant's first instinct is to share it with the empath. They see something funny, they hear a certain song, they have a rough day, and for just a split second, before they catch themselves, they reach toward where that person used to be, and no one's there. And the avoidant does what they always do with feelings that feel too big. They minimize them, they rationalize them, they tell themselves they're better off. They remind themselves of every reason the relationship wasn't working, every reason the empath was too much, too needy, too intense, too emotionally demanding. But all that minimizing takes energy. And that energy starts costing them more than they expected. Here's the part most people miss when they talk about avoidance going through no contact. The avoidance suppression of emotion doesn't mean the emotion isn't there. It means the emotion has been shoved underground, and buried emotions don't stay buried forever. They leak up through the cracks in ways that often don't look like grief at first glance. The avoidant might find themselves irritable for no clear reason, short-tempered at work, restless at night. They might notice they're drinking a bit more, working a bit too hard, filling every silence with noise in a way that feels slightly desperate, even to them. And if they're self-aware enough to get quiet, even for a moment, which most avoidants are remarkably skilled at avoiding, they'd find something waiting beneath all that productivity and forward momentum. They miss the empath. Not in some dramatic, overwhelming way at first, more in a quiet, nagging way. The way you miss something you never realized was essential until it was gone. But the avoidant doesn't call it missing. They won't even let themselves think that word. They call it adjusting. They call it needing time. They call it getting their life back on track. And they keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, the empath is somewhere around week 2 or 3, and something is starting to shift for them too. The initial chaos of no contact begins to settle into something different, not peace yet, but a kind of tired stillness. And in that stillness, something quietly remarkable starts to unfold. The empath begins to hear themselves again. Because when you spend months or years with your entire inner attention locked onto tracking another person's emotional state, your own inner voice goes very quiet. You stop hearing your own needs. You stop recognizing your own feelings as separate from the feelings you're constantly absorbing from your partner. You turn into a tuning fork vibrating at someone else's frequency, and you completely forget what your own natural frequency even sounds like. But once the signal stops, once the avoidant is no longer there to track, a kind of internal quiet settles in. And inside that quiet, the empath begins to hear, for the first time in a long time, the sound of their own thoughts. And what they find there can be deeply uncomfortable, because many empaths, once they get honest with themselves in that stillness, realize what they were calling love actually had a real component of something else, something that takes real courage to name, a compulsion, a need to be needed, a fear of their own emptiness that was quietly being filled by the project of loving someone hard to reach. They start asking uncomfortable questions, not about the avoidant, but about themselves. Why did I stay when I was consistently unhappy? Why did I read their withdrawal as a challenge to love harder instead of a sign that this was fundamentally mismatched? Why did my own sense of worth get so tangled up in whether or not I could reach them? These aren't easy questions, but they're the right ones. And the fact that the empath is asking them by week 3 is actually a sign that something genuinely healthy is beginning to take root. Now, while the empath is doing this internal digging, the avoidant is starting to hit a very different kind of wall. Around the 4 to 6 week mark, something starts happening inside the avoidant that their defenses have an increasingly hard time holding back. They start to idealize. Human memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. And when we're in pain, even pain we're suppressing, we rebuild the past through a filter that highlights what was good and downplays what was hard. This isn't some character flaw, it's simply how human memory functions under emotional strain. And so the avoidant begins remembering the empath, not as they actually were, not as the person who felt like too much, not as the relationship that felt suffocating. They begin remembering the empath as they felt in the very beginning, back in the early days when everything still felt new enough to feel safe, when the empath's attentiveness felt like magic instead of pressure. When being truly seen felt like a gift instead of exposure, they start remembering a version of the empath that's at least partly built, a highlight reel, and they begin missing that version with an intensity that catches them off guard. This is the point where the avoidant becomes genuinely risky to the no-contact process, because their idealization, combined with their present discomfort, combined with the fact that reaching out feels far less vulnerable than sitting with their own feelings, creates a powerful pull to make contact. And here's the cruel irony baked into avoidant psychology. The same person who kept withdrawing throughout the relationship, the same person who kept communicating through distance that closeness felt like too much, is now right on the edge of reaching out. Not because they've done any real inner work, not because anything has fundamentally shifted, but because the discomfort of the absence has, for the moment, outgrown their fear of closeness. And often, they really do reach out. A text, a message that sounds casual on the surface, something low stakes, at least on paper. Hey, just wanted to check in. Or, saw something that reminded me of you. Or simply, how are you? And when that message lands in the empath's phone after weeks of silence, something seismic happens. Every carefully built day of healing suddenly feels shaky because that message feels like exactly what the empath was secretly waiting for, without ever admitting they were waiting. It feels like proof they were right to believe in this person. It feels like the breakthrough they spent months trying to create through love, patience, and sacrifice. It feels like the avoidant has finally chosen them. But this is actually the moment of greatest danger in the entire no-contact process, for both of them, because the avoidant hasn't changed. Not yet. They've simply grown uncomfortable enough to reach toward the thing that felt good. The second contact is re-established and some of that discomfort eases. The old patterns will snap right back into place with a speed and completeness that feels almost automatic. The empath will feel hope and start giving again. The avoidant will feel the pressure of closeness return and start pulling away again, and the cycle will start all over. Unless, and this is a very specific unless at least one of them has actually used the no-contact period to do something genuinely different on the inside. So let's talk about what genuinely different actually looks like for each of them. For the empath, doing real inner work during no contact means starting to locate the wound that made avoidant love feel so magnetic in the first place. Because here's the hard truth the empath needs to hear. The reason avoidant love felt so intoxicating was never random. The push and pull, the warmth followed by withdrawal, the love that had to be re-earned again and again, that pattern felt familiar on a cellular level. For a lot of empaths, it echoes the very first love they ever experienced, the love of a parent or caregiver who was emotionally inconsistent, sometimes present and sometimes not, whose approval felt conditional, whose love had to be chased. So when the avoidant pursues and then withdraws, some deep part of the empath recognizes that pattern and believes, well below conscious thought, that if they can just finally win this person's steady love, they'll heal something inside themselves that's been broken for a very long time. But that healing was never going to come from outside them. That's the terrible truth, and also the liberating one. The empath has to learn, often for the very first time, what it actually feels like to tend to their own emotional needs, to notice what they're feeling without instantly handing that feeling over to someone else's reaction, to recognize their own worth without measuring it through how much someone else desires them. This is enormous work. It's quiet work. It's unglamorous, but it's the only work that actually changes anything. And for the avoidant, doing genuine inner work during no contact means doing the exact thing they've spent an entire lifetime perfecting the art of avoiding. It means sitting with discomfort long enough to actually feel what lives underneath it. It means getting honest about what the withdrawal was really protecting them from, not just in this relationship, but in all of them. Going back to childhood, in every moment they made themselves smaller or colder or more self-sufficient because being fully emotionally present felt too dangerous. It means asking a question avoidants almost never let themselves ask. What would happen if I actually let someone in? What's the specific fear hiding underneath all this distance? Is it abandonment? Is it being smothered? Is it the terrifying possibility of needing someone who might not stick around? These questions feel unbearable to someone whose entire coping system was built around not feeling things at all. But without asking them, the avoidant will keep repeating the exact same pattern in every relationship for the rest of their life. The attraction, the intimacy, the overwhelm, the withdrawal, the return, and around again. Now here's what happens over the longer stretch of no contact when neither person does that work, which unfortunately is the most common outcome. The avoidant reaches out somewhere around the 6 to 8 week mark. The empath responds. There's a stretch of reconnection that feels incredibly hopeful, incredibly charged. Both of them feel that original spark again. Both of them feel the relief of having the other one back. And within weeks, sometimes even days, the exact same dynamic resurfaces, because nothing fundamental has actually shifted in either of them. The empath starts to feel that familiar anxiety of wondering where they stand. The avoidant starts to feel that familiar pressure of closeness. The empath gives more. The avoidant pulls back. And the whole devastating, beautiful, painful cycle starts over again. This can drag on for years, sometimes decades. But here's what happens when at least one of them has actually done real work during the no-contact period. And let's be clear, it usually only takes one. If the empath has genuinely started to understand their own wound, genuinely stopped outsourcing their sense of worth to the avoidance reactions, something in the dynamic shifts in a fundamental way the moment contact happens again. The empath no longer chases, not because they're playing some game, not because someone told them not chasing is a strategy to make the avoidant want them more, but because they genuinely no longer feel the desperate pull that drove the chasing in the first place. They found enough solid ground of their own that they no longer need the avoidant to be that ground for them. And this genuinely throws the avoidant off because the avoidant's entire unconscious relationship strategy depends on the empath doing the chasing. The chasing is what lets the avoidant control the levels of intimacy. When the empath chases, the avoidant can retreat, and retreating keeps them safe. But when the empath stops chasing, the avoidant is left sitting with genuine uncertainty, the very thing they've spent their whole life running from. And one of two things happens. Either the avoidant retreats for good and finds someone new to repeat the pattern with, or, for the first time, that discomfort becomes the spark for real growth, because the usual escape route has closed. The avoidant who has also done real inner work during no contact, who has sat with the hollow silence long enough to understand exactly what they were running from, comes back to the conversation changed, not perfectly healed, not magically fixed, but genuinely different in a way the empath can actually feel. They're less guarded, not entirely by choice, but because holding up those defenses has become too exhausting now that they can see what those defenses were actually costing them. They're more honest about their own needs, including the need for connection, which is real and deep and has been buried for a very long time. And the empath who's done the real work comes back into the conversation with boundaries that aren't weapons, but genuine reflections of what they need to be in a healthy relationship. And sometimes these two changed people, who genuinely struggled to love each other well, find a way to build something new, not a continuation of the old dynamic, but something truly different. But even more often, the real outcome of no contact, when both people actually take it seriously, isn't a reunion, it's a graduation. Both of them graduate into a clearer understanding of who they are and what they actually need from love. The empath stops chasing validation from people who aren't available. They start finding deeply loving relationships with people who can genuinely meet them where they are emotionally. And at first this feels less exciting because they're not used to connection being easy. But over time it starts to feel like something they didn't even know they were allowed to have. Real peace, real safety, real partnership. The avoidant, if they've done the work, stops fleeing from intimacy like it's a fire. They start to understand that being vulnerable won't destroy them, that letting someone in doesn't mean losing themselves, and that opens doors that have stayed shut since childhood. Now let's talk about the thing nobody wants to talk about, the thing sitting underneath all of this. Because everything we've covered so far, the chasing, the withdrawing, the cycling, the idealizing, the no contact, all of it is really just a symptom of something deeper inside both of them. At their core, both the empath and the avoidant are operating from the exact same wound, just expressing it in opposite directions. The wound is a deep uncertainty about whether they're fundamentally lovable simply as they are. The empath says, Consciously or not, I'm only lovable when I'm giving, when I'm useful, when I'm taking care of you. I have to earn the right to be loved. The avoidant says, consciously or not, I'm only safe when I'm needed from a distance. If I let you all the way in, you'll see I'm not enough, and then you'll leave. So I'll leave first. Different expressions, the exact same route. And no contact, at its best, isn't a strategy to win someone back, or to prove a point, or to create distance that makes the heart grow fonder. No contact, at its best, is a forced pause long enough to actually hear what you've been telling yourself about your own worth. That's where the real work actually lives, not in waiting for a text, not in hoping they'll change, not in strategizing over whether to respond. It lives in the quiet, in the stillness, in the uncomfortable territory of truly sitting with yourself and asking who you are when you're not defined by this other person's pain. Because honestly, answering that question changes everything. It changes what you choose next. It changes who you let in. It changes what you're willing to accept and what you're finally, firmly, gently willing to say no to. For the empath, the end of this road looks like this. Someone who still feels deeply, who still cares enormously about other people's inner worlds, but who has learned to make their own well-being non-negotiable, not selfish, just sustainable. Someone who can offer love from a place of fullness instead of anxious compulsion to earn their spot. For the avoidant, the end of this road looks like this. Someone who still values space and independence, who still needs solitude to recharge, but who no longer uses those needs as a weapon or a wall. Someone who can say, I need some time to myself right now, and then reliably come back, without the other person having to chase them down. Both of these people are capable of loving and loving well, but it takes a willingness to sit inside the discomfort of no contact, not as a tactic, but as a genuine encounter with themselves. This is what actually happens next, when an avoidant and an empath both go no contact. Not fireworks, not instant clarity, not a dramatic reunion or a clean, tidy ending, just a slow, often painful, eventually freeing process of finally coming home to themselves. And in the end, that's the only journey that was ever really worth taking. The relationship was the classroom. The silence is where the real lesson finally lands. What you do with that lesson shapes every relationship that comes after this one. If any part of this landed for you today, if you recognized yourself in the empath or the avoidant, or honestly in both, because most of us carry pieces of each one, drop mirror in the comments and stay close to this channel, because this is only the beginning of the conversation.